So this piece is really going to be the preliminary or preface or introduction to a sorting piece that I'm going to follow up with. And I want to distinguish the preface from the performance to the best of my ability. And the way that I want to do that is to to constantly refer back to the idea that what is being done now in this performance is a contextualization of what will follow. And I think that's an important idea, contextualization, and I'll explore it in various ways. But what we're looking at is an image photograph of Richard Serra's Tilted Arc from 1981. I think it was up from 1981 to 1988 or possibly 89 when it was removed. And I'm not really explicitly going to talk about the merits or otherwise of the work, but of the legal argument, for its removal and the defense of the piece, and what was left out of that argument. And one of the contexts for talking about this piece is I had recently been talking about a program called ARC, and I had been talking about it in various ways, some overt and some covert, relating to this idea of arc and the symbolism of arcs in art over and across time. Well, this very much looks like a ship in this photograph, doesn't it? Or perhaps an adze, or wedge. Obstruction is an issue, right? In this particular piece, who is being obstructed, or what is being obstructed, whether it's a view or light or an opportunity, or to digress just a bit. Once I was doing a piece on gentrification and human displacement in Milwaukee, and the excuse for being in Milwaukee was that I was performing in this sort of improvisational film made by the filmmaker Jennifer Montgomery. But in fact, what I was doing and what my wife and I were doing we were working with issues of human displacement and gentrification around these transformations of these neighborhoods that were, formerly largely inhabited by African Americans and working class people, and that were being transformed and gentrified, to the applause of certain profiteers, but also to a select portion of the art community as well, who found residences in these areas. And in the course of making this film with Montgomery, I was the human displacement performance occasionally would run over into the various stagings and sets of that piece that we were using basically as an excuse to be there. We were funded excuse me, funded by that project so that we could do our project, and excuse the long digression, but in the course of one of those overflow discussions or discourses, I was very much surprised that an individual on the camera crew said, well, what's wrong with gentrification? Those people can just get housing elsewhere. And yesterday, in a discussion on Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, I heard a similar comment. Well, people can just go around it. And And the context, I'm sure, was made innocently enough, and it wasn't made as a challenge to, disability rights, but it reminded me very much of that comment, concerning gentrification, and it also reminded me of comments that I've heard regarding, disability rights and the obstacles they provide for the successful performance of certain businesses, right? Like, well, if we have to do that, we're going to lose too much money and we're going to go out of business. So rather than seeing the obstacle as whatever it is, the edifice that impedes, the individual with a disability, it's the disability rights organization that provides an obstacle, to the fair conducting of the business, right? So it's kind of like inverting the idea of the obstacle. And all of this, I guess, and the fact that Aaron and I had received a message regarding Lord Vinayaka, the remover of obstacles, Ganesh, inspired me to think about what is an obstacle. So is for example, so in as far as I know, in the legal arguments regarding the removal of tilted arc, disability rights issues was never part of the legal argument, if I recall correctly. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I remember the idea being that workers in the federal building, couldn't eat their lunch in the way that they wanted to. Or let's see what it says. Bless you. Bless you. Keeping the plaza unobstructed constituted a permissible, content-neutral place and manner restriction on free speech. I'm not really sure. Property rights, freedom of expression, a lot of abstractions. This is also like a word that I heard in the discussion on Sarah yesterday, that his art was, universal and human, right? Not that there were no issues of positionality involved in the work, which it always is a red flag for me, because I recognize that how these universal constructs have functioned to impede human rights across time. I'm not finding anything, but I don't recall. See, reactions. I don't recall anything about impeding access to the federal building for people with disabilities or special ambulatory needs. And it probably wouldn't have been, because the Civil Rights Act overall wasn't passed until 1990. Disability Rights Act wasn't passed until 1990, and I believe, but we can look at the timeline, that the first bill measure, assuring, access rights to individuals with disabilities was in 1984. So it would have been odd if the government had argued that Sarah's work was impeding the progress of individuals with disabilities when they they didn't even have a law ensuring access to public buildings at that time. So let's go ahead and check. I think it was really more about like whether we get sunlight when we have a lunch break or not than it was about impeding. All right, so this is a timeline of the history of accessible facility design. Now I'm going to assume that Lord Vinayaka, the remover of obstacles, was in favor of each one of these measures, right? So that if there was an obstacle, and if tilted arc were such an obstacle, right, then Lord Vinayaka would have, favored its removal. Now, that other argument, these laws get in our way. They're obstacles to our performing our whatever, artistic expression, an obstacle to our artistic expression, an obstacle to the functioning of our job. We'll address all those earlier. And keep in mind, this is the preface or contextualization for a performance piece that will be performed later, right? Okay, so here's the timeline. Okay, so this is merely the first one, 1961, is a design, a design definition, right? A private sector model design standard. Okay, that has nothing to do with. Okay, so the first example of a government act is in fact the Civil Rights Act of 1964, discrimination in public places, right? Which tilted arc could have fallen under if that had been the rationale, right? But I don't think there were any architectural barriers acts at that point. Okay, so architectural barriers acts of 1968. All right, so already by 1968, like this argument could have been used, right, in defense of the removal of tilted arc, had there been, employees in the building or a need for individuals with motility disabilities to access the building, and perhaps individuals with visual impairments as well, right? You wouldn't want to be tripping over a tilted arc. Or you could just go around it, I mean, we do have a right to. Your blindness is getting in. Your blindness is an obstacle to my right to express myself. I don't know. Let's confer with Lord Vinayaka on this one. All right. So here's the real one, though, right? Because it's the Uniform Federal Accessibility Standard, UFAS, which really won't make any difference until 1990, because that's the way that politics and the implementation of these acts work. But by 1984, you had real justification, real legal justification on the federal level for something like what would have been, an argument to remove tilted arc. Uniform Federal Accessibility Standards. All right, so, but like I said, that won't really become enforceable until the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, is implemented in 1990. But let's go ahead and look at it. And this is already page not found. That's just exactly right. That's been my experience with this organization known as the federal government as well. So that doesn't really do us any good. Let's see if this one is found. I would hope so. All right, so basically this probably stipulations within this bill probably replace whatever was in the 1984 Act, which, like I said, didn't really have much clout until this was finally implemented. And we have some familiar names here, right? Loretta Lynch. All right, so let's go back to Tilted Arc and see what was in place at the time. Let's see. Wow, the arguments. The arguments for its removal are quite poor, and really have nothing to do with the way that. I like this one. Every time I pass this so-called sculpture, I just can't believe it. The General Services Administrator or whoever approved of this goes beyond the realm of stupidity. This goes into even worse than insanity. I think an insane person would say, how crazy can you be to pay, la 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 la. So it was all just like that it was offensive to these people. And the insane keeps coming back up. Like, this person really like distinguishes himself from the insane. I'm always amused by people, who use words like stupidity and refer to others than themselves as insane, because, it seems to me that, truly intelligent people don't use words like this, or aren't concerned with distinguishing themselves from the insane. But, that's just me. Really poor argument. I'm not arguing anything like that. What I am arguing is that the only rational argument for its removal would have been that it is in fact an obstacle for people with disabilities and infringes upon their rights, and that such an obstacle is more important. The removal of such obstacles, as Lord Vinayaka would support me on, is more important than the obstacle of bad taste, right? This guy's rant on insanity is an obstacle to freedom of expression, right? Well, in spite of what your preference for the word insanity and stupidity, we still do have the right to express. Now that it is an obstacle, because we all know people like this, right? These sort of reactionaries that want everything to look a certain way. And if anything looks too modern, or if anything, meets with their disapproval, they're going to censor it. I have this obstacle every day of my life with, YouTube and people getting in the way of my doing my work. So I'm very much aware that it is an obstacle to the freedom of expression, right? And I put all kinds of stuff up that in no way has any nudity in it. Like, for example, the moon. And yet the moon is accused of being obscene by the YouTube algorithm. So there are such obstacles in the way of expression, and they should be, dealt with. But there are also like greater obstacles, in the course of people conducting their lives and work and having the right to exist. And those need to be addressed, and that's what my work does, and that's why it's work, and why I've argued that it's more than just play, even when it's playful, right? And Tilted Arc is playful, and Richard Serra, I'm sure, is very playful and has the right to be playful, but we also, the rest of us have the right, to be playful and to have work too, and some of those rights, are more important than other rights, right? You can put things in hierarchies, and that's why that's why conceptual design and physical access design is so important. All right, so we have answers to all of our questions, other than when the trial was. So if the trial was, okay, so it's interesting that the Visual Artist Rights Act was implemented the same year that the ADA regulations, were implemented. So, okay, so then you have a potential conflict between the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and the Visual Artist Rights Act of 1990. Okay, now, so if let's suppose I'm talking to an artist, and I try to explain my idea of like hierarchies of rights. I wonder if the artist will understand that the rights referred to in the Disabilities Rights Act should supersede and override whatever the Visual Artist Rights Act are. I wonder if I would be able to communicate that there are hierarchies of rights. Like, for example, that your right to express yourself can never become an obstacle or an impairment in the right of someone with a disability to perform the duties of their labor or the activities of their daily living. I wonder if I would be able to explain that to someone who was a visual artist. And I would be able to explain that to a visual artist if there were a universal standard, right? If things weren't taken from a particular perspective, but we could easily jump to that universal subjectivity that was granted to the work of Richard Serra, right? So from a universal human perspective, this would be obvious, right? So granting the work of Serra this universalized perspective, and let's grant it a moral universal perspective as well as an aesthetic universal. So having granted it that, and having conceded to the argument that it's universal and not a function of a positionality, then we're going to go ahead and say, well, it's obvious, isn't it, that whatever exists in this, right, is recessive, let's say. This is a recessive act. And the dominant act, we're just putting it in genetic terms, the dominant gene would be the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, right? Now, what would be the obstacle? And I may need to confer with Lord Vinayaka on this one as well. What would be the obstacle in getting an individual that sees the merits of the Visual Artist Rights Act of 1990, but doesn't see the differend involved in the conflict with the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and doesn't see that differend is in fact no differend because it's entirely resolvable because this is the recessive act. would be the obstacle? Moral rights, all right, versus civil rights or human rights, or the obstacle would be the position of one's self-interest. The obstacle would be positionality itself, and then that would dissolve, right, the appeal to universality that we had made before. So you in a sense, you can't have your cake and eat it too. If the work is universal, then it can't be an obstacle. It can't be a physical obstacle, can it? If the work is universal, it can't be a physical obstacle. Can we repeat this? All right. So that's enough on all of that. And the reason that we're going to we're going to enlist that. Well, maybe I'll do one more thing. I had brought up. I wonder if I can do this. Oh, this will be interesting. All right. So you have some notes there on the back, and then you have a text, and the reason that I had printed this was because I had been talking about this organization called ARC in New Mexico, and I had been talking about this organization ARC in New Mexico, which employs and supports individuals with disabilities, especially developmental disabilities, but other kinds of disabilities as well, and they operate thrift stores and other things in order to earn money for individuals, and to support those individuals in various work programs and things like that. And I had been talking about ARC and all of these books that I got when I was sorting my library. I had been discussing these various books that I had either purchased at the ARC store in Farmington, New Mexico, or that they had given me for free, and because of my support of that program. And a lot of them were art books, yeah. And I had also been talking about this subminimum wage provision in the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, and what it entails and what it means for individuals with disability who can be employed in various positions at subminimum wage. So for example, since we're in New Mexico, let's do New Mexico. So in 2018, in the state of New Mexico, there were 300 or more, actually, over 300 individuals with disabilities who were employed via these subminimum wage provisions and the subminimum wage certificate that is granted certain organizations. 300 individuals employed under the federal minimum wage guidelines and the state minimum wage guidelines. And there's a law that allows this to happen, and this is the law, and it's a provision of this act under section 14C, employment of workers with disabilities. And I'll just read it. Authorizes employers, after receiving a certificate. These certificates are referred to sometimes as special minimum wage certificates, and receiving a certificate from the Wage and Hour Division to pay special minimum wages less than the federal minimum wage, to workers who have disabilities for the work being performed. And I had mentioned that the organization Goodwill, which was touted as the successful business model for people with disabilities, uses this provision and actually does time studies on individuals with developmental and physical disabilities that work within their organization. So Goodwill has this particular certificate, and then based on these time studies, they pay them sub-minimum wage. So for example, like if within this time study they have a model norm, right? So I don't know, and it's not bell curve scored, right? It's just it's like it's a percentile scoring mechanism, and by percentage. So they have this model norm, and that norm is like a point or a position in this equation of work time relationships, and that norm is distributed, according to the percentage that one can meet that norm. So if an individual performs in this time study at 50% of what this random point is, utilizing this, equation, then they can be provided with a wage that reduces their earning capacity to 50% of minimum wage, right? And there's a provision here for, there's a provision for student learning that it doesn't go lower than 75% of applicable minimum wage. But there's no such provision for individuals with disabilities, right? And I have been witness to the fact in a movie theater in California, where two individuals were, receiving a single minimum wage, right, doing the work. So at least as low as 50% of minimum wage, was provided for that particular instance, and this to me is this provision is an obstacle, to refer back to what we were referring to before. These obstacles, it's an obstacle in the process of challenging. Is an obstacle in the receipt, right, of rights, and in the fairness of wage labor, for individuals with disabilities, just like not having a wheelchair ramp, is an obstacle. We have to think of the absence of the wheelchair ramp as an obstacle. We can't universalize and say, well, there's no obstacle because there's no thing there. The obstacle is that there is no thing there. The obstacle is the absence of the ramp. So the obstacle here is the presence of this provision, right? And what is an obstacle to? It's an obstacle for individuals with disabilities to receive, equal and fair treatment under the law and the provisions of the law that relate to labor. Correct? Right. So that is something that is has to be regarded as a political issue, because there was an insight, like an understanding. There wasn't a universal moral understanding to begin with, right? And so we had to point out that that the absence was the obstacle, right? Or the presence here of this provision is the obstacle. We had to make that clear because of the lack of universal understanding and ability to comprehend, right? All right, so that's that. The piece that I'm going to perform is, a sorting by books, art books, a sorting of art books by art books that I acquired at ARC versus art books that I acquired elsewhere. And this is the context, for that sorting. And I'll say one more thing regarding that sorting, which is that and I'm going to need to flip my paper around to do that, because I need to remember the name of this other organization. But as I mentioned, in 2018, in the state of New Mexico alone, there were 300 individuals with disabilities who were receiving less than minimum wage under this other, we don't have a page up for that, but under this, the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, provision, section 14, provision C, and we'll go back to Sarah. We'll go back to Sarah as obstacle, and I like Richard Serra. I mean, I don't want anybody to think that I'm picking on Richard Serra because I don't like his work, or because I think like that person who made the statement that only crazy people like it. Quite the contrary. I like it a lot. I'm merely saying that if there were an argument against it, it could be made in these terms, and that would be a reasonable argument, as opposed to the irrational arguments that were made against it. And because I do what I do, I'm supposed to do that, right? I'm supposed to get in trouble and have people not like me, because otherwise, we'll never make any progress, and we will never get anywhere. And people with disabilities will never get into any buildings, whether there's a Richard Serra there or not. So, back to 2018. In 2018, when some of these issues around Section 14C became issues in the state of New Mexico and its legislation of laws regarding fair labor payment. It was interesting that the organization ARC actually supported changes and challenges to the regulations, and supported transitioning individuals with disabilities working in sub-minimum wage positions to minimum or higher standard positions. And so they were very much in support of the challenges made to that provision in that section. And other institutions, and this is why I needed to remove the paper, because I have the name of that, one of the detractors, right, of challenges to that provision was Adelante Development Center. And Adelante Development Center very much used this argument of the obstacle. Adelante Development Center said that, and I should probably say something about, what that is. Adelante Development Center is, part of what I would call the disability industry, meaning that they receive, money funded through social services and state organizations, largely, and that's why you have to keep a lot of paperwork, and organizations like Social Security and things like that, and community centers. And their function is to find jobs for individuals with disabilities in the community, as opposed to Goodwill, who both finds jobs in the community for individuals with disabilities, but also provides labor, right? And ARC is the same. They provide jobs and they find jobs. All right, so that having been said, and Adelante Development Center being part of the disability industry, their argument was that removing, right? So the absence of this provision, right? Again, the absence of the provision would create a barrier in their ability to find work for these individuals in the community. So again, you have like an absence that becomes a barrier. So removing this provision that allows for subminimal payment would be an obstacle. Now, essentially what it's saying is the only way that we can get work for individuals with disabilities, right, is to have employers pay them sub-minimum wage. What it fails to say is that, why is that? And if you've ever worked, in in job development with individuals with disability, and I know this to be a fact because I have, you'll understand that the reason that employers don't want individuals with disabilities is because we have a biased and bigoted and prejudiced society. And I've already told stories about, employers looking at my clients strangely and uncomfortably if they have a speech impediment or obviously Down syndrome individuals or have an impaired limb and these individuals often don't want to say, yeah, I don't want that person working for me, right? They'll say, well, oh, I'm busy now, come back later, or there's no position open, but pressed. And if you press them and if you push enough buttons so that they get over that, I want to look like a nice guy, and just are willing to say, well, this guy I'm talking to is an asshole, they'll admit it. Yeah, I don't want your client. And so you have to get there, sometimes just to go on. But what this act, the implicit argument in the obstacle, thing is, but given that, that they get this great labor deal, like they'll do it, right? Because they're capitalists and they're greedy and they're so we can get around the obstacle of bias by giving them these incentives, but that's not what we want to change. I'm sorry, at Adelante Development Center, but we're working toward larger changes than that, and we're working toward larger understandings of the functionality of universals and particulars and positionalities within the constructs of our intellectual and aesthetic and very, rarefied Kantian and Hegelian judgments, right? And so in doing so, we're not here to make friends or to give anybody great deals. We're just here, to remove obstacles, right? And that's the context for the sorting piece that I'm going to provide. Hopefully today, but if not today, at a later time. So this is the preface. So finally, as the coda, so to speak, to the preface for the performance that I want to give, I'll end the preface with a brief poem. Based on Richard Serra's description of the design of Tilted Arc, and I'll only read a part of that description, but the description begins, the viewer becomes aware of himself and of his movement through the plaza. As he moves, the sculpture changes. Contraction and expansion of the sculpture result from the viewer's movement. Step by step, the perception not only of the sculpture but of the entire environment changes. So this poem based on that statement is called Universal. The human universal is a design. Within the human universal design, there is a viewer who is universal. The views of the design and the designer within the human universal are a view of seeing as seeing. This is not a metaphor. For the viewer, to become part of the design of the human universal, the viewer must see. Seeing is the design of the human universal. The design of the human universal is to become aware. The design of the human universal is to become aware in this way, as human universal. If the design of the individual experiencing awareness falls outside of the human universal, the individual experiencing the delusion of awareness can no longer be defined as one who is aware. This falls outside the design of the human universal. The design of the human universal can be framed by the pronoun him. He is the design of the human universal. She, they, and other pronouns, such as John Oliver, fall outside of the design of the human universal and cannot be conceived as part of the human universal design, because the human universal design belongs to himself, his, and he. In the human universal design, he moves through the plaza. In the human universal design, there is a plaza, the plaza, not two plazas or three plazas. There is a he, not a they or a she. The movement consists of an individual moving through an individual plaza. This is part of the universal design. If there is more than one plaza with more than one individual described by a pronoun other than he, this is not part of the universal design and falls outside of the work of the human universal. As he moves through the plaza, the sculpture changes. Part of the human universal is a relation to the changes of the sculpture through the movement of the human universal, who is a he within the plaza. If he cannot move within the plaza, he is not part of the human universal. If he cannot move because he's impaired by an obstruction to movement, such as being limited in mobility by either a physical or cognitive factor, he does not belong to the human universal and cannot experience the changes in the sculpture in the way that the human universal demands. If he cannot experience the changes in the sculpture through movement, he does not belong to the design of the human universal and cannot be granted access to the experience of the human universal design. The human universal design involves the experience of the contraction and expansion of the sculpture. As this experience of contraction and expansion result and relate to the seeing human universal subject's experience of changes in the seeing universal human subject's movement through space and time. If the seeing human universal subject cannot move through space and time in the manner provided by the human universal construct of the sculpture, the seeing universal human moving subject does not belong to the seeing human universal construct of the piece, and hence falls outside the human universal. Contraction and expansion are metaphors of the seeing human universal subject who moves universally in space and time. The expansion and contraction of the sculpture are literalizations of the metaphor of the seeing, moving, universal subject as constructed by the universe to which the seeing, universal, moving subject belongs in the discourse of the human universal. The seeing universal moving subject steps into the work in order to perceive the work. If the seeing moving universal subject is incapable of stepping for reasons of either physical impairment or cognitive inability to conform to the workings of the universal human sculpture, the subject of the experience can no longer be defined as the human universal. The human universal, therefore, steps. The human universal subject is a stepping subject. The human universal subject steps by steps. The human universal subject can just go around stuff that the human universal subject otherwise might experience as an obstacle. The human universal subject experiences no difficulty or has no complaints in just going around that kind of stuff. There's a lot of stuff that the human universal subject will find he just has to go around. It's not such a big deal. The human universal design is borrowed from great philosophers of the past, like Immanuel Kant and Hegel. The universal human design is occasionally signed into law. The universal human design has a very prominent place in the institutions and spaces of our great traditions of gallery space and museums. The great universal design transcends politics. The great human universal design should have its own set of human rights, because it is, after all, the great universal human design.